the weigher of hearts.
The scales never lied. Anubis stood in the silent hall of judgment, the air thick with the scent of incense and decay. Before him, the soul of a pharaoh trembled, its essence flickering like a guttering candle. The man's heart still glistening with the weight of his sins rested upon the golden plate of Mates scale. The feather of truth hovered opposite, pristine, untouched, the balance tipped. The pharaoh's heart sank, dragging the scale down with a metallic groan. His mouth opened in a soundless scream as Amit stirred in the shadows, her crocodile jaws dripping with anticipation. Then something shattered. A ripple tore through the duet, a discordant note in the symphony of the afterlife. The scales trembled, the feather shuddered, and the pharaoh's heart moved on its own, twitching like a dying insect before lurching off the plate and onto the obsidian floor. It did not rot. It did not dissolve. It beat. Anubis' jackal ears twitched. No soul had ever resisted judgment. No heart had ever refused to be weighed. Yet this one pulsed, defiant, its veins threading outward like roots, digging into the stone. The chamber's torches guttered, their flames turning an unnatural blue. Somewhere in the mortal world, a thief smiled. Somewhere in the dark, a scroll was unrolled, and the balance of life and death cracked. Anubis reached down, his claws closing around the heart. It burned, not with divine fire, but with something older, something that did not belong. The god of the dead lifted his gaze toward the mortal realm. The scales would be set right, even if the heavens had to bleed for it.
The stolen scroll.
The tomb walls wept blood. Nefrit, the thief of forgotten gods, moved through the shadows of the duet, like smoke through a burial shroud. The air here was thick with the breath of the dead, the weight of centuries pressing against her mortal lungs. But the pain was nothing compared to the prize. Before her, resting upon a pedestal of black basalt, lay the ritual of the last breath, the scroll that commanded the dead to rise. Its papyrus pulsed with a sickly green light, its hieroglyphs writhing like serpents beneath her gaze. The priests had warned her. The carvings had threatened her. None of it mattered. Her fingers closed around the scroll. The moment she touched it, the duet screamed. The walls of the tomb convulsed, stone cracking like brittle bone. The mummified guardians lining the corridor twitched, their bandages unraveling as something ancient and furious stirred beneath their dried flesh. Nefrit didn't wait to see them rise. She ran, the scroll burning against her chest, her sandals slipping in the sudden flood of black ichor seeping from the walls. Behind her, the dead woke in truth. Anubis felt the theft like a knife between his ribs. The scales in the hall of judgment trembled, their golden plates clashing together in discordant strikes. The souls of the newly dead writhed, their forms flickering, as the stolen magic unraveled the threads of their fate. The god's claws flexed, his jackal snout wrinkled in a silent snarl. A mortal hand had dared pluck divinity from the underworld. A mortal will have dared defy the order of eternity. The shadows around Anubis deepened, swallowing the light whole he stepped between realms. The duet bent to his rage, its corridors twisting, its traps awakening. Nefrit felt him coming before she saw him, the air turned to ice in her lungs. The torch in her hand guttered and died, though no wind had touched it. And then, a whisper of sand against stone. The weight of a gaze older than empires, she turned. Anubis stood at the end of the passage, his eyes twin suns in the dark, his form towering and terrible. The shadows around him were not shadows at all, but the hands of the dead, reaching, yearning. Nefrit clutched the scroll tighter. The god spoke no words. He didn't need to. The dead were already answering.
Gods among ashes.
The mortal world smelled of decay and defiance. Anubis stepped through the veil between realms, his paws sinking into sand still warm with the blood of fallen kingdoms. The cities of men lay in ruins, their grand temples reduced to rubble, their gods' names scratched out from every wall. The Nile itself ran sluggish and thick, its waters choked with the bloated corpses of those who had prayed to deities that never answered. The thief was here, somewhere. The stolen scroll's corruption seeped through the land like poison, its dark magic twisting the natural order. Anubis felt it in the weight of the air, in the way the wind carried whispers that should have been silenced by death. The dead walked here not as honored spirits, but as hollow puppets, their empty eyes glowing with stolen light. A village burned on the horizon, its screams carried on the smoke. Anubis moved toward it, his shadow stretching long and monstrous across the dunes. The villagers had barred their gates, piling broken statues of forgotten gods against the doors in a futile attempt at protection. They did not see him pass through the flames untouched, did not feel his presence as he stood among them, watching as their loved ones dead for seasons returned with hollow smiles and grasping hands. A child wept over her mother's body, freshly torn open by teeth that had once kissed her brow. The god's claws flexed. This was not the work of the thief alone. Something older stirred behind her actions, something that had waited in the dark for its moment. The dead turned toward him as one, their mouths stretching into grins too wide for human faces. Anubis, they hissed, 100 voices speaking as one. We remember you. The god of the dead bared his fangs, and the village burned brighter.
The jackal's curse.
The dying pharaoh's breath rattled like sand in a hollow gourd. Anubis stood at the foot of the golden throne, his black fur glistening under torchlight that seemed to shy away from his presence. The palace walls, once adorned with vibrant murals of gods and conquests, now bore cracks like spiderwebs, seeping black ichor that smelled of rotting papyrus. The pharaoh's fingers, skeletal and trembling, clutched a dagger carved from a meteorite, the last relic of a covenant between mortals and the divine. Save her, the pharaoh whispered, his voice barely more than a gust of wind through a tomb. At his side lay his daughter, Nefrit the thief who had stolen the scroll, her skin now marbled with veins of black, her breath shallow. The scroll's magic had turned against her, its power too great for mortal flesh to contain. She was dying, not just in body, but in soul, her essence unraveling like frayed linen. Anubis tilted his head, studying the pair, the scales in his mind tipped justice demanded her punishment. Yet something in the pharaoh's plea, in the way his dying heart still clung to hope, gave the god pause. The dagger glinted as the pharaoh pressed it into his own chest, drawing a thin line of blood. I bind you, he gasped, his life spilling onto the blade. By the old rites, by the blood of kings. The curse took hold instantly. Anubis' claws flexed as the magic coiled around him, ancient and unyielding. The pharaoh's blood sizzled against the dagger, its edge humming with a power not even a god could ignore. The pact was clear save the thief, or be bound to the mortal realm forever, his divinity withering like a plucked lotus. The pharaoh's last breath left him with a smile. Nefrit's eyes fluttered open, her gaze locking onto Anubis. Fear flickered there, but beneath it, something worse triumph. The god snarled, the sound echoing through the crumbling palace like a storm. The dead would rise, the balance would break, and he, the weigher of hearts, was now bound to the one who had set it all in motion. The jackal's curse had begun.
Sand and shadow.
The desert breathed hunger. Anubis walked the wastes with Nefrit stumbling behind him, her breath ragged from the curse that bound them both. The dunes stretched endlessly, their golden surfaces marred by dark fissures where something ancient stirred beneath. The wind carried whispers of the dead, but these were not the honored ancestors of the Duat, these were the forgotten, the devoured, the things that had been buried before gods walked the earth. Nefrit coughed, her hand pressed to her chest where the scroll's corruption still pulsed. Black veins spider-webbed from beneath her fingers, creeping toward her throat. She was dying, even as she lived. The pharaoh's curse had stayed her fate, but not erased it. Anubis paused, his ears twitching at a sound beneath the sand. The attack came swift as a striking serpent. Bones erupted from the dunes, not human, not beast, but something in between. Skeletal fingers, each as long as a man's arm, clawed at the air before sinking into the earth, dragging their monstrous forms forward. Their skulls were elongated, their jaws unhinged like jackals, their hollow eyes burning with a sickly green fire. The first one lunged for Nefrit. Anubis moved faster. His claws tore through the creature's ribcage, scattering bones like brittle sticks. But the fragments twitched, reassembling before they even hit the sand. More emerged, their skeletal forms clicking together in a grotesque mockery of life. They did not attack him, they avoided him, as if sensing the divine blood that ran through his veins. Their hunger was for her. Nefrit scrambled back, her dagger drawn, but the blade trembled in her grip. The creatures circled, their movements to fluid, to knowing. Anubis bared his fangs and howled. The sound shook the desert, sending cracks through the earth. The dunes trembled, collapsing inward as something far below answered. The skeletal horrors froze, their fire-lit eyes widening in something like fear. Then the sand beneath them opened. A maw of teeth and shadow swallowed them whole, dragging them screaming into the depths. The silence that followed was heavier than death. Nefrit stared at the god, her face pale. Anubis did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sky burned the color of old blood. The desert had remembered its old masters, and they were waking.
The Bone Prophet.
The ruins of the oracle's temple jutted from the sand like broken teeth. Anubis stepped through the shattered archway, his claws clicking against tiles inscribed with prophecies long faded. The air here was thick with the scent of myrrh and decay, the remnants of sacrifices left to rot under a sun that no longer cared. Nefrit followed, her steps unsteady, the black veins of the scroll's curse now creeping past her collarbone. At the center of the ruins sat the prophet, or what remained of him. His body was a skeletal thing, held together by strips of leathery sinew and strands of gold wire. No skin clung to his bones, no eyes sat in his sockets, yet he saw. His fingers, yellowed with age, clutched a staff of human femur and obsidian, its tip dripping a thick, dark liquid that pooled between his bare feet. He turned his head before they spoke. "Anubis," the prophet rasped, his voice the sound of wind through a tomb's crack, "you are too late." The god's muzzle wrinkled. Too late for what? The prophet's bony hand lifted, pointing to the far wall where the remains of a mural clung to the stone. The paint had peeled, but the image was clear gods, their throats slit, their crowns shattered, their bodies feeding a great maw that opened beneath the world. Nefrit sucked in a breath. The prophet's jaw creaked open, wider than any living man's could, and from the hollow of his throat poured not words, but voices, hundreds of them, overlapping, screaming, whispering. The sound made Nefrit's nose bleed, the crimson droplets hitting the sand with a hiss. The pantheon sleeps, the dead voices chorused. The false king wakes, the Nile will drown the unworthy. The scales will tip, and the jackal will howl, and the world will be unmade. Then, as suddenly as it began, the voices stopped. The prophet's bones collapsed into dust, his staff clattering to the ground. The obsidian tip shattered, releasing a swarm of scarabs that skittered in frantic circles before burrowing into the sand. Anubis stared at the empty space where the prophet had been. The message was clear. The war had already begun, and the gods were losing.
The Crimson Nile.
The river bled. Anubis stood at the water's edge, the once sacred currents now thick with rust-colored foam. The Nile no longer sang, it gurgled, choked on the bodies of the drowned. Bloated corpses bobbed in the shallows, their skin split like overripe fruit, their mouths stretched in silent screams. Nefrit gagged beside him, her hand pressed to her nose. The stench was more than decay, it was the metallic tang of old magic, of rituals performed in reverse. The stolen scroll's corruption had festered here, twisting the river into a conduit for something far worse than death. Then the waters parted. A figure rose from the depths, wreathed in rotting linens and strands of riverweed. The gold of his funerary mask had tarnished black, his eye sockets glowing with the same sickly green fire that had lit the skeletal horrors in the desert. More followed, dozens, then hundreds, each crowned with the remnants of their sovereignty, each moving with unnatural precision. The pharaohs had returned, but not as honored ancestors, as hunger-given form. The first one lurched onto the bank, its bandages sloughing away to reveal flesh that writhed with river parasites. It opened its mouth, and the voice that emerged was not its own, but a chorus of the damned, layered over the guttural growl of something far older. "Anubis," it hissed, the scales tip. "The throne sits empty. Will you kneel?" The god's claws flexed. These were not true resurrected, they were puppets, hollowed out and filled with the will of the false king who even now gnawed at the roots of the Duat. Behind them, the Nile darkened further, its currents thickening into something almost solid. Villages downstream would drown in blood before nightfall. Nefret's dagger was in her hand before Anubis could stop her. She lunged, her blade sinking into the nearest pharaoh's chest. The corpse smiled, its hand snapped up, skeletal fingers closing around her wrist. The flesh there blackened instantly, the corruption spreading up her arm like ink in water. She screamed, but the sound was cut short as the pharaoh's other hand gripped her throat. Anubis moved. His claws severed the pharaoh's arm at the elbow, the limb crumbling to dust before it hit the ground. The other revenant shrieked, a sound that made the river itself recoil. The god bared his fangs. The dead would learn their place, even if he had to drown the Nile in their ashes to remind them.
The silent pantheon.
The celestial gates stood broken. Anubis ascended the shattered steps of the divine precinct, his paws leaving bloody prints on marble that had once gleamed with eternal radiance. The air here was thick with the stench of ichor and abandonment, the great halls of the gods now empty, their altars cracked, their offerings rotting where they lay. The silence was worse than any scream. It was the quiet of a tomb where even the dead had fled. Nefret limped behind him, her arms still blackened from the pharaoh's touch, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She shouldn't have been able to walk these halls, no mortal could, but the curse that bound them had carved a path even through divine wards. The throne room yawned before them, its vaulted ceiling open to a sky that pulsed like a bruise. Where this solar bark should have blazed across the heavens, only a sickly twilight remained, the sun itself seeming to shy away from what had become of its kin. One by one, Anubis approached the shrines of the pantheon. Hathor's mirror lay in shards, the glass weeping blood. Thoth's scrolls had been reduced to ash, the words still smouldering at the edges. Osiris' throne was draped in cobwebs, his crook and flail rusted through. And at the center of it all, the great scales of Mat hung broken, one golden plate dangling by a thread, the other gone entirely. Anubis' claws scraped against the stone as he knelt, pressing his forehead to the cold floor. He called out not with words, but with the resonance that had once bound the gods together, the thread of divinity that connected them across realms. No answer came, only a whisper, so faint it might have been the wind. "They are not gone, they are taken." Nefret staggered, clutching her chest as the scroll's corruption flared in response to the voice. The black veins pulsed, spreading further, and for the first time, Anubis saw true fear in her eyes. The false king's reach was longer than they had feared. And the pantheon, they had not abandoned the world. They had been harvested.
The scarab's oath.
The ruins of Khepri's temple festered beneath a moon swollen with blood. Anubis descended into the buried sanctum, the walls carved with forgotten hymns to the dawn that would never come again. The air reeked of damp earth and crushed beetles, their iridescent shells crackling underfoot like brittle bones. Nefret followed, her corrupted arm now hanging limp, the black veins creeping toward her heart. She shouldn't have been able to walk, let alone breathe, yet the curse sustained her, a cruel mockery of life. At the heart of the ruin, the scarab god waited. Khepri's form was a horror of chitin and gold, his beetle shell cracked with age, his human hands withered to claws. The great sun disk he had once pushed across the sky lay behind him, its fragments swarming with his children beetles that fed on divine flesh. His voice echoed from 1,000 clicking mandibles. You seek what was buried, not a question, an accusation. Anubis stepped forward, the weight of the silent pantheon heavy on his back. The stolen scroll's power had grown to vast, the false king's reach to deep. Only a god of beginnings could offer an ending. Khepri's antennae twitched. The oath requires blood, not yours. His many eyes fixed on Nefrit. She understood before Anubis could react. The dagger was in her good hand before the god could stop her, its edge biting into her own wrist. Blood, thick and black with corruption, splattered across the scarab god's altar. Khepri moved. One moment he was across the chamber, the next, his claws were buried in her chest, not to kill, but to sculpt. Nefrit arched, a soundless scream tearing from her lips as the beetles swarmed over her, their tiny legs stitching, carving, rewriting. The corruption in her veins boiled, reshaping itself into something older, a map of the duet's hidden paths, a key to the hollow throne. When it was done, Khepri withdrew, his claws glistening. Nefrit collapsed, gasping, her skin now etched with golden sigils that pulsed like a second heartbeat. The scarab god turned to Anubis. You will carry her to the end. And when the scales tip, you will remember the price. The beetle surged forward in a gleaming tide, dissolving the remnants of the shattered sun disk. And in its place, a door opened, a door that led down. To the throne, to the war, to the end of all things.
The hollow throne.
The duet had forgotten its master. Anubis descended through layers of unraveling reality, the air thick with the screams of souls that no longer recognized him. Nefrit stumbled at his side, her body alight with Khepri's golden sigils, each pulse etching her flesh deeper with the map to the underworld's heart. The path behind them crumbled as they walked, the very fabric of the afterlife rejecting their presence. The throne room yawned before them, a cavernous maw of obsidian and bone, its pillars carved from the spines of forgotten gods. At its center, where Anubis had once weighed hearts against the feather of truth, now sat the false king. He wore Anubis' face, but twisted, hollowed out, his jackal features stretched to wide over a maw that never stopped grinning. His form flickered, as if barely tethered to existence, his claws tapping restlessly against the arms of the throne, a grotesque mockery of Anubis' own seat of judgment. Around him, the stolen pantheon hung suspended in webs of screaming darkness, their divine essence siphoned drop by drop into the usurper's gaping mouth. Nefrit gasped, her golden scars flaring, as the false king's gaze fell upon them. Little thief, the thing crooned, its voice the sound of tombs collapsing. You brought him to me. Anubis stepped forward, his claws scraping against the black glass floor. This abomination was no god, it was the echo of the first doubt, the first corrupted judgment, given form by the scroll's power and fed by stolen divinity. The false king rose, his limbs unfolding to long, to many. The duet shuddered, and the battle for the afterlife began not with a clash, but with a scream, Nefrit's. The golden sigils tore free of her skin, becoming chains that lashed around the false king's limbs. Khepri's oath, his final trick, the usurper howled, his stolen face melting like wax as the chains bit deep. Anubis moved, his claws found the thing's chest, and the duet held its breath.
The last judgment.
The scales hung broken, but they still burned. Anubis stood before the ruins of his own judgment hall, the golden plates of Mates scales twisted and blackened, their chains snapped like old bones. Around him, the pantheon groaned in their web prisons, their stolen divinity flickering like dying stars. The false king's essence still clung to the hollow throne, a stain of corruption that pulsed with every breath of the underworld. Nefrit knelt at the base of the dais, her body a map of golden scars and blackened veins. She should have been dead, perhaps she was. The curse that bound her to Anubis had become something else, a tether, a key, a wound that would not close. The air trembled. One by one, the souls of the dead gathered, not in orderly procession, but in a writhing tide of the judged and the lost. They pressed against the ruined hall, their hollow eyes fixed on the scales. They had come for answers, for vengeance, for an end. Anubis lifted his claws, and the duet held its breath. This would not be a weighing, this would be a reckoning. The first soul stepped forward, a pharaoh, his core flickering with the same green fire that had animated the corpses in the Nile. He opened his mouth to speak, but Anubis was done listening. The god's claws tore through the spirit's chest, not to destroy, but to reveal. The pharaoh's essence unfurled like a rotten scroll, displaying every sin, every moment of cruelty, every drop of blood spilled in his name. The other souls shuddered as the truth hung bare before them. They were all guilty, gods and mortals alike. The scales trembled, their broken chains rattling. A single feather materialized on the left plate, not the pristine white of mat, but a twisted, blackened thing that reeked of betrayal. The right plate remained empty. Waiting, Nefrit staggered to her feet, her golden scars burning brighter. She understood before Anubis did. The final judgment required a heart, and hers was the only one left to weigh.
The eclipse of Mat.
The sky split with a sound like tearing flesh. Anubis watched as the sun drowned in its own light, swallowed whole by a darkness that bled across the heavens. The air itself grew thick, tasting of burnt copper and spoiled honey, the scent of cosmic order unraveling. The feather on the scales burst into black flame, its ashes swirling upward to join the devoured sky. Nefrit's heart still hovered above the golden plate, untouched, but not for long. The ground beneath them cracked open, vomiting forth the remnants of the false king's army, skeletal warriors clad in melted gold, their eye sockets blazing with stolen divinity. The stolen pantheon writhed in their webs, their muffled screams shaking the crumbling pillars of the hall. Anubis bared his fangs. This was no longer judgment, this was war. He moved like a sandstorm given purpose, his claws carving through the resurrected horrors, their bones crumbling to dust before they could strike. But for everyone he destroyed, two more clawed their way from the fissures, their weapons forged from broken oaths and dead prayers. Nefrit stumbled backward, her hands pressed to her chest, where her heart should have been. The golden scars on her skin pulsed in time with the dying sky, each throb sending cracks through her flesh. She was coming apart, the curse, the map, the key, all of it had been leading to this moment. The scales trembled. The right plate remained empty, waiting. A shadow darker than the eclipse loomed behind the throne. The false king had not been destroyed. He had been waiting. His form unfolded from the darkness, no longer wearing Anubis' face, but something far older and more lined with the teeth of forgotten gods, a crown of screaming souls, a voice that was the sound of the world's first grave being dug. The balance is broken, it whispered. The age of gods is over. Anubis lunged, and the sky fell with him.
The jackal's howl.
The darkness trembled. Anubis' claws met the false king's maw, and the impact sent cracks racing through the fabric of the duet itself. The usurper's teeth shattered like glass, but the wounds sealed instantly, his form oozing backward like smoke. Around them, the last remnants of the judgment hall collapsed, its pillars reduced to dust, its golden scales melting into the abyss. Nefrit's scream cut through the chaos. The false king's tendrils had found her, wrapping around her legs, dragging her toward the crumbling edge of existence. Her golden scars bled light, each drop sizzling where it struck the void. She was unraveling, not just dying, but unmaking, her very essence feeding the thing that had worn Anubis' face. The god of the dead bared his fangs, and howled. The sound was not of this world, not of any world. It was the cry of the first predator, the song of the last grave being dug. The Duet answered, its broken laws bending to the will of its true master. Shadows became teeth, silence became a weapon. The false king recoiled, his form flickering, as the howl tore through him. Anubis did not stop. He advanced, his body unraveling at the edges, his divine form shedding its mortal-seeming shell. What remained was something older, something darker, a jackal-shaped void, a hunger that had existed before light, a judge who had never needed scales to know the truth of a soul. The false king struck back, his claws raking through Anubis' shadow flesh, but the wounds sealed with whispers of dead languages. This was no longer a battle. This was an execution. Anubis' jaws closed around the usurper's throat, and the Duet held its breath.
The final weighing.
Silence flooded the ruins of the Duet. Anubis stood amidst the wreckage of the afterlife, his shadow form still bleeding darkness where the false king's claws had torn through him. Before him lay the remnants of the golden scales, their chains shattered, their plates cracked but still, somehow, holding. Nefrit knelt at their base, her body barely more than a husk. The golden scars had burned out, leaving her flesh charred and peeling. The black veins of the scroll's curse pulsed weakly, their poison spent. She was empty now of magic, of divinity, of everything but the single, shuddering heartbeat that refused to stop. The last heartbeat, the last choice, the scales trembled. Anubis reached for her not with claws, but with something softer, something forgotten. His touch, when it came, was almost gentle. Nefrit looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time without fear, and then she pushed. Her hands pressed against the golden plate, her remaining life flowing into it like water into sand. The scales screamed as they righted themselves, the broken chains knitting back together, the cracks sealing with threads of her fading breath. The feather materialized not blackened, not twisted, but pure, radiant, whole. And for the first time in eternity, the scales balanced. The Duet exhaled, and Nefrit smiled as she dissolved into light. The last weighing was done, the last debt was paid. And Anubis, god of the dead, stood alone in the silence, waiting for the end or the beginning.
The nameless after.
The world woke different. Anubis stood at the edge of the Nile, his paws buried in silt still damp with the memory of blood. The river ran clear now, its waters whispering over stones instead of choking on corpses. The sun burned high and ordinary in a sky no longer bruised by dying magic. The scales were gone. The throne was empty. The gods did not return. People moved through the ruins of temples with downcast eyes, their hands brushing absent-mindedly over old scars where divine curses had once festered. They no longer spoke the names of the pantheon not out of fear, but from something worse, forgetfulness. Anubis walked among them, unseen. His form had grown thin, his divinity bleeding away with every step. The balance had been restored, but the cost had been more than Nefrit's life. More than the stolen scroll, more than the hollow throne. It had been the faith itself. The world no longer needed a weigher of hearts. On the outskirts of a nameless village, a child paused in her play, her fingers hovering over a half-buried scarab amulet. The gold had dulled, the carvings worn smooth by time. She glanced up, her dark eyes scanning the horizon where the desert met the sky. For a moment, she saw him, a shadow, a whisper, a jackal's silhouette against the setting sun. Then the wind shifted, and he was gone. The child pocketed the amulet and ran home, her laughter trailing behind her like a prayer, or one remembered how to speak. And Anubis, the last god, turned his face to the stars. The world was remade, but some shadows never fade.